Good evening, everybody, and thank you for the warm welcome. I've never walked out from behind a curtain before. I don't know whether that's good or bad. As Rebecca mentioned, the title of the book that I recently completed, We Do Know How. It may be worth a few minutes to explain where that title comes from. I'm not really going to talk about my book, per se, but I'm going to try to talk about some basic principles of how to do good international development in a way that it actually turns into something, that it actually creates income for real people and actually creates jobs. The title, We Do Know How, that's the title of the book, but again, I'm not going to stick to the organization of the book. Is really in reaction to a seminal book in development that came out in 1973 by a husband and wife team called the Pagets. And as you can see from this quote, this is the bottom line, they did an evaluation of development experience up to that point in Central America and Mexico, and basically came to the conclusion, we don't know what we're doing. We're very well intentioned and all of that, but we're really not having an impact. An interesting book to read, actually, at some point. And the reason that I chose the title, We Do Know How, is not that I'm a big smarty, right? But over 40 years, we've learned some lessons. And what I've tried to do in the book is to try to catalog some of those lessons in a way that comes out as a coherent approach that if you follow it with rigor and discipline, it actually does deliver sales for entrepreneurs and jobs for poor people. And I'm going to give some evidence to that effect, and then try to talk about some of the key principles that make this particular approach to poverty reduction work. Immediately I'm going to say I do not have all the answers to poverty. I'm not going to say that this works in every single possible environment that you can imagine, but it has been tried in enough environments and in enough different places over a number of years that I think there is enough empirical evidence to actually give it some serious attention. Where does it come from? The approach comes from experience with my last employer, Chemonics International, primarily through contracts with the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, AID, however you want to call it. But there's nothing really proprietary here. In fact, the more and more I go on tonight, I think you're going to begin to say, hey, this guy's not telling us anything really new. And I'm going to really try to argue this, doing good development ain't rocket science, but it's sticking to some basic principles in a disciplined, coherent way. To give you an idea of some of the environments in which we've tried the approach, this gives the range of about maybe 15 different countries over the last, now 15 years. In which I've personally had the opportunity to work. It's really been very gratifying. The one that I'm going to refer to the most is the one that, as Rebecca mentioned, it was the one that I directed back in, now I guess it is almost 15 years ago, in Peru. And that will be the one that I'm going to refer most for the data and for the stories because it has run the longest and there are more lessons from that particular experience. Okay. The rest of my presentation tonight I'm going to start with a story, and then I'm going to use that story to highlight 7 important features of this approach. And I would argue, to try to be some provocative and get you thinking along these lines, a lot of you are reading development, have worked in development, and these words are like buzzwords in development. Everybody's demand-driven, right? Everybody believes in the importance of building trust. Everybody's really oriented toward results. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Motherhood and apple pie. I would argue that it is a rarity that you're going to find projects and programs overseas in which these features are really adhered to. And I'm going to challenge you tonight to rethink some paradigms that we've inherited over time. And honestly, some sloppy thinking that we've allowed ourselves to get into, which actually turns into less than optimal results. Let me start with the story. While I was living in Peru, and this is about 2001, we came in contact with a trout processing company called Piscifactoría Los Andes. And Piscifactoría Los Andes at that time, it was a family company, very conservatively managed. They had their own ponds, they had their own processing plant, and they had a guaranteed market. Basically, they sold everything that they produced to Scandinavian buyers, and those buyers told them that they could actually take up to 3 times more of what they currently produce. So there really, in this case, was not a demand problem. But they were really quite content to stay right where they were. We're a family company, we got everything under control, we're earning a good living, don't rock the boat. But from a development perspective, ironically, about 10 miles away, there was an ex-hacienda that had been expropriated during the time of the land reform of the military government in the 1970s. And this place was enormous. It was 250,000 hectares, which is the equivalent of about 600,000 acres. And it actually covered 10 different departments in Peru. Department is the equivalent of a state here. Okay, so it just gives you an idea of how enormous this place was. But the land reform had really not gone well at all, and this whole ex-hacienda was bankrupt. But in its time, it produced trout. And it had ponds there that were apt for producing trout, no more than 10 miles away from Piscifactoría Los Andes. And so from a development perspective, we said, technocratically, right? These people who are on this old farm could grow the trout, produce the trout, and sell it to Piscifactoría. Piscifactoría could then on-sell to Scandinavia. Win-win-win for everybody. Sounds good. So we go and call on the president of Piscifactoría Los Andes. And we're talking with him and say, you know, down the road a piece, not very far from you, is this ex-hacienda. It was called Sais Tupac Amaru. And if we were to provide technical assistance to them so that they could produce trout to your specifications, would you buy from them? And what was the answer? No. You got to be kidding, right? Those bunch of lazy slobs are never going to produce for me on time, on quality, or the timeliness that I require. Forget it. Ciao. All right? So we went to the SICE, to the ex-hacienda, and we talked with them. And we basically asked them the other side of the question. Suppose that we were able to convince Piscifactoría to buy from you, and we gave you the assistance to produce to their specifications, would you sell to them? And what was the answer? No. Why? Okay, that fat cat's just going to rip me off. Any contract that I sign is not going to be worth the paper that it's written on. Complete, utter lack of trust between the two parties, okay? Or for those of you, I heard through the curtain, that a number of you are studying economics, okay? This is your classic market failure. Okay, in which all the assumptions that we make in development economics don't hold because there's frictions in the market that actually prevent transactions from taking place. So what happened? It turns out that one of our local, I was really the only American gringo on this project. Everybody else was local. And one of our advisors in our office that we had set up near to, in the city of Huancayo, near to the town where Piscifactoría was located, he was one of these guys that just did not take no for an answer. And so he went back and forth over a period of 9 months to convince the two parties to enter into a contract with each other. We wound up calling him the ping pong advisor. And it was like a birth. It took literally 9 months from the time he started until finally at the end, Piscifactoría agreed to invest $87,000 in the rehabilitation of the ponds on the SICE itself. And the SICE agreed to receive technical assistance, to receive the fry, to receive the fish food from Piscifactoría and to sell back to them. Obviously at a price in which the cost of those inputs were discounted. Okay, and it worked. And it worked really very, very nicely. Now, there's been some hiccups over time, but it's gone well. The interesting thing though, and I mentioned this from the perspective of those of us who want to save the world first before we save individual cases, okay? The light bulb went off for PC Factoria, and they said to themselves, heck, if we could work with these people whom we never expected that we could work with, we can work with other communities as well. Over the course of the next 10 years, they expanded to work with 15 other different communities inside Peru to 3 different regions, and there's a boom of trout export production that's been going on for the last 5 years from Puno, the southern part, the poorest part of the country, as a result of that. In the process, PC Factoria has generated its $24 million of sales that it would never have generated, and 1,700 jobs have been created in the process among these various communities. Okay. Now, number of lessons there that I'm going to, as I move toward the different features of the approach. First, the importance of the question of trust. That was really the key service. You can do all the sort of the formal technical assistance that you want, but if you don't have trust between parties, okay, and this is not just idiosyncratic to this particular example. Basically, everywhere I've worked, the lack of trust between buyer and sellers and the absence of rule of law is the key impediment to making transactions happening. Okay, the other thing is, in this particular case, there was demand. I'm going to really harp on this for about the next 10 minutes and the importance of that particular lesson. And the final part is really focusing on the particular problems at hand. Not trying to solve the world, but just working on individual business problems. Okay. Now, the first feature that I mentioned about the approach that I'm talking about is being demand-driven. And for those of you who have read any of the development economics literature, this is almost like a mantra. Everybody is demand-driven. I would argue that 9 out of 10 of us in this room, 9 out of 10 people who are doing development are classic supply pushers. And I want to give you some examples from the real world to make my case. If you could read this particular few sentences, please. Now, my question to you is, reading that, this is from a draft World Bank strategy for Peru for development of the Andes. Is that demand-driven? Is that approach demand-driven? Why not? Exactly. All it says, we can grow this stuff. That's all that really says. At the end, it says, oh yeah, we have to develop the market. Developing the market can have an impact. But is that demand-driven, meaning that there's a demand that is actually driving decisions as to what to produce? No way. Next one. This is a little bit more subtle. It's from the scope of work for the development of business development services market in Madagascar. Is this approach demand-driven? It's a little bit more subtle. What does the first paragraph, the first sentence say? A few private companies in Madagascar offer a range of business services. They are business service providers, services to businesses. But they appear expensive and as such are rarely used by small and medium-sized agribusiness. In other words, there ain't no demand. Right? Therefore, in identifying commercial solutions, the contractor will develop private sector suppliers. This can be done in building local capacity for commercial service provision to ensure sustainable impacts. So, in a situation in which we have absolutely no demand whatsoever, we are going to create more supply so that we have more business service providers not being able to make a living. Complete non sequitur. Okay? Reads nice, doesn't it? Blah, 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 building capacity, all the right buzzwords are there. But it makes no sense whatsoever. Next one. Now, this is written by an engineer consultant for the company that I used to work for. about the advisability of building a juice processing facility in Azerbaijan. Is that approach demand-driven? Could be. True, it could be. It does. The thing is, it doesn't say, right? And the reason I choose this particular one is because for those of us who are not economists, and even for many of us who are economists, we tend to use the word interest, need, and demand as if they were synonyms. And that's far from the truth. Let me give you a story to illustrate the point. As you come down from the Andes, from where Piscifactoría was producing the trout, down into the jungle, there's an area called Aguaitia. And in Aguaitia, they produce coca. And coca, with 2 more steps of processing, you know what that turns into. Okay? Coca is very, very easy to produce. It grows on land that can be very, very, have no nutrients whatsoever. It's a bush. You pick the leaves every 3 months. You put them out in the road. You dry them. And the narcotraficantes come in and they pick it up and they absorb all the risk for you. Deal made. Why would I stop producing coca? Why should I sweat and try to create a cacao plantation or a coffee plantation? And what development projects have tried to do to, I mean, people know that it's illegal and all that, and they would prefer not to, but the economic incentives are just really, really strong here. And so what development projects have tried to do is say, okay, why don't we negotiate with communities and say, you have an asset. You have these coca bushes. If you agree to destroy these coca bushes, we will give you in exchange some other asset. And then you can negotiate with the community as to what that asset will be. Well, in this particular case, the community said, okay, we'll eradicate our coca, but what we would really like you to do is, can you install for us 50 hectares of pineapple of this particular kind? Because this pineapple is selling very, very well in the supermarkets in Lima. Sounds good. But before we went ahead, we said, we better check with the supermarkets. And we went to the supermarkets and we found out that if in the entire country more than 7 hectares more of that particular kind of pineapple were produced, the price would fall flat to the floor. Okay? And the very people who were looking for help would wind up actually in a worse position. So we decided not to go ahead with it. But for those of us who are think of communitarian help, okay? A lot of non-governmental organizations sort of adapt communities to work with. Very often the reaction that we have is, the community hath spoken. The community has demanded the pineapple. But in fact, they've expressed an interest in the pineapple, they've expressed a need for the pineapple, but they haven't really verified whether there's a demand for the pineapple. 2 very, very different things. And what I'd like to argue here, really, really strongly, if we don't want to wind up hurting the very people that we want to help, we need to do our homework first ourselves to guarantee that the market is there. And that market, in very concrete terms, means a buyer with a first name, a last name, an email address, and a telephone number. Not vague statistics, not donor reports, but doing our homework to actually tie the buyer down if we're really going to have an impact. Let me take one more macro, because this is really an important point. Another macro case from Peru. In a previous incarnation in the early 1980s, mid-1980s, I lived in Peru at the beginning of the first administration of President Alan Garcia. At that point, he was a young 35-year-old, really handsome, really sexy, really dynamic, and he was inheriting the mail to Felipe Gonzalez's being the leader of socialism throughout the world. And he really wanted to have an impact, a lot of energy. And he came in and he talked with people in the Ministry of Agriculture, where I happened to be working at the time. And he said, the poorest area in the country is Puno. What do they grow in Puno? Well, they grow potatoes. Okay, well, why don't we subsidize the production of potatoes so that they can produce more and therefore they can sell more and everything will be fine. So they did. What happened? Improved, these are just common run-of-the-mill potatoes, okay? Basically a commodity. And what happens in a commodity market when you flood it? The price went right to the floor, and the next thing that Alan Garcia knew is that he had 3,000 potato farmers marching in front of the palace demanding recompense for a poor policy, affecting the very, very people that he really intended to help, but in real naivete and lack of really doing homework, okay, made the wrong choice. Okay, now, any of you here marketing majors? Okay. This is the dictionary definition of marketing, not the textbook definition of marketing. And I want you to look particularly at 1B and tell me whether that's demand-driven. Marketing has to be demand-driven, right? Markets, all that kind of stuff. Marketing, according to the dictionary, is the process or technique of promoting, selling, and distributing a product or service. In other words, I've already decided what I'm going to produce, and I'll worry about how I'm going to dump it in the market later. In contrast to what the textbook definition of marketing says. So I know what the consumer really wants and try to satisfy that. Okay? Honestly, most of the people that I have worked in marketing in my career are not textbook practitioners, but dictionary practitioners. And with the very same bad consequences I was talking about before. Okay, this one. Finally, the right question, right? Is anybody going to buy it? Okay, summarizing all this stuff. Even though product moves physically from the supplier to the demander, we have to think the other way around. I was commenting to somebody earlier today that the typical titles of association meetings involved with agriculture usually have a subtitle that says, from farm to table, from farm to fork, right? If we really thought from market orientation, we would say from fork to the farm, because really, unless we know what the person with the fork is going to eat, why bother producing the stuff on the farm? Now you can say I'm being facetious, but all I'm really trying to point out is we have these paradigms in our head that we have inherited, and we need to question them and to think the other way around. The lemma of our project became produce what you can sell, not sell what you produce. For those of you who speak Spanish, it's much more eloquent in Spanish. Producir lo que se vende, no vender lo que se produce. Okay, or, pictures speak 1,000 words. If forever I have been producing oval watermelons, and somebody comes along and says that they want square watermelons, what do I produce? I produce square watermelons. Okay, and evidently you can, by boxing them in and controlling it. No, that's a real photo. That's not made up. Okay. I'm not going to, given time constraints, I'm not going to dwell on these. My only point that I really want to make here is the importance of, again, it being personal. These particular sentences come from a workshop that we had in Azerbaijan about whether to help clients produce tomatoes or not. And represent kinds of questions that I have got leading programs over the years, where people come into you and say, the market's there. Help me produce more. And the reaction has got to be, no, show me first. Do our homework. All right, have I beaten this horse dead enough? Because it's really, really important. Because we don't even realize that we actually tend to think the other way. Okay. The second major feature is the question of trust. And I think that really came out strongly in that trout example. The only thing that I would really mention, that I would really like to underline here, is that is not the exception to the rule, the story that I told. Yeah, in the dramaticness of the commentary, yeah, okay. But in my experience, that is the key constraint. We all come from different disciplines. Okay? Whether it's the law, whether it's agronomy, whether it's economics, whatever. And that's great. But very, very often, the key to solving the problems doesn't come from our own discipline. And we have to be broad-minded enough to realize that we've got to step out of the box to do that. Okay, now, results orientation, being focused on, oriented toward results. This quotation comes from an actual CV of somebody who has worked in development for years. And it's what, on the front page of the CV, you have a list of all your attributes. And one of them is proven results. And this is how this individual describes proven results. Read that and tell me whether you would hire him. No, right? I mean, if somebody's oriented toward results, tell me about the results. All of that is process. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Beautifully politically correct language. Okay, but it says nothing about whether this individual he may have. He may very well have. But if he has, at least show me a number. One number anyway. Okay? Another story to illustrate this point that we tend to think that we're results-oriented, but really aren't. Early last spring, I was in El Salvador at a workshop. And the government of El Salvador has a program that's promoting micro and small businesses. And they have set up different offices to provide services so that these very small businesses can prosper. And to their credit, and this is really an exception to the rule, this particular program set targets for each one of its different offices. But what were the targets? The targets were, during the course of the year, give so many courses, give so many technical assistance sessions. So the workshop that I happened to be at was, after 1 year of operations, each of these offices was coming in and reporting on their accomplishments over the previous year. So the first one stood up and said, our objective was to have 14 different courses and to give 135 technical assistance sessions. We gave 15 courses and we had 136 technical assistance sessions. Everybody claps, isn't that wonderful, meets the, okay? Next one, goes up, similar story. Meeting the targets right on the head, right? Now, you probably can see from the tone of my voice and where I'm going with all of this. What was going through my head as I was listening to all that? What do you think? I'm sitting there and I'm saying, so what? Right? They're not telling me anything about whether those courses meant anything. Right? Presumably the reason that you're giving courses is so that these small businesses can make more money. No mention of that whatsoever. Okay? Basically, this program was evaluating itself on its inputs rather than its outputs, its outcomes as opposed to its processes as opposed to its outcomes, whatever lingo you want to use. Okay? Rather than really focusing on results. And who cares if how many courses that you gave if the problem was something else entirely? So why set targets for intermediate stuff at all? It really makes no sense. Moreover, why collect data, force people to collect data on it, when really what you want to know is, did it have an effect on sales? And this is the pattern of the sales that took place in Peru in the program that I was managing there. And this was the pattern of the growth of jobs. I should note, for those of you concerned a little bit, let me get theoretical for one moment. Why am I putting these two up, sales and jobs? The logic is simple. Presumably what we want to do with our scarce resources overseas is help people get out of poverty. But to get people out of poverty, people have to have jobs. And people are only going to have jobs if there's economic activity, which means that businesses are selling more. Now, you can point out all sort of very minor empirical examples in which you can have more sales with less jobs because of technological trade. Okay? But 9 times out of 10, if you sell more, okay, you're going to need more people. And the more people that you're hiring, the more people you're getting out of poverty. And that's why we're focusing on these particular kinds of results in each of our programs. And I would argue that that's the kind of results orientation that we want, that we focus on final outcomes, not on intermediate ones. Okay, accountability. This is another one of the things that we're in point of fact, for those of you who have worked in the AID or World Bank business, there's a lot of supposedly innovation going on, right? To try to do this, try to do that. But what is the real accountability for result? If people don't meet the results, is there really any penalty? For example, you describe me as a social entrepreneur, but in fact, I've earned a salary my entire career. Okay? I got paid by the hour. Okay? I would argue that structurally that was the wrong thing to do. You should pay me for what I actually accomplish. Or at least a portion of what I'm doing should be a function of what I actually accomplish. What is the standard mode of operation, let's say, in agriculture overseas? There's a problem with some kind of pests on the farm. We'll bring in an external technical assistance person to provide some technical assistance. The farmer will adapt and it will change practices and everything will be hunky-dory. Okay? But how does the individual giving that technical assistance get paid? By the number of hours put in and the beauty of the report produced. Not by the actual final result. One innovation that we used in our project is we paid performance bonuses, essentially like sales commissions, in which the more, like that ping pong advisor, the higher the sales of his clients, the more he earned. Okay? And we had a formula that was agreed upon beforehand. Even though recognizing it's a tough world we're living in, particularly in developing countries, to be able to take that kind of a risk. But with just even a small performance incentive structure in place, the way that motivated people, I can't tell you, it was incredible. Okay, I'm not going to go into how we actually collect the data, but simply to make the point, if you're going to have performance bonuses, then you have to have good data to back it up. And you have to take data very, very seriously, not an afterthought. Okay, the discipline of the 5-to-1 rule leads to cost effectiveness. And this gives you, for the longest programs that we're running, at least when I first put this particular graph together, this allows you to compare different programs in terms of their cost effectiveness. The ratio, as you can see, of sales to actual contract costs is 7.26 in Peru. Kosovo did a lot better, as did Paraguay. Learning from some of the mistakes, actually, that we made in our program earlier. But the operational point that I really want to make here is I can remember years ago when I was with the government and then early acting as a consultant back to the government on how to deal with poverty questions overseas. And you sit around a table and you say, that's an interesting idea. Let's try that. Okay? Let's be innovative. Okay, let's think outside the box. And so we try something supposedly new. Okay? We never asked beforehand, hey, seriously, how much actual result do I expect per dollar spent? That became, well, we'll worry about that kind of thing later. Okay? It's like playing poker with other people's money. If that were your own money, would you ever behave that way? You would ask beforehand, if I really want to have an impact, now this doesn't mean the money that comes to me, this is the money that you're talking about that actually adheres to the people who are earning more money as entrepreneurs and as being employed earning many more salaries. Okay? And so what we finally introduced as something to be asked beforehand is what we had the 5-to-1 rule. Is it reasonable to expect that for every dollar that I spend, there will be at least $5 of client sales out the other end? And if we can't answer that question, say no. And one of, I think, the tragedies of a lot of our programs trying to be so innovative and so forth is we don't do enough saying of no and instilling the rigor and the discipline that's necessary to use our resources wisely. Ex-Prime Minister Tony Blair once said, the major mark of leadership is not being able to say yes, it's being able to say no. Okay, just to mention that we actually calculated in the case of the data for Peru an actual internal rate of return, taking into account the latest advances in evaluation methodology and so forth. Okay. It's very common, both in development agencies and in countries themselves, to try to pick the star product that's going to save them. Okay, if we can only get one sort of champion product out there in the world, we'll be fine. And what I'd like to argue is that that doesn't make much sense whatsoever. And let me illustrate it with two anecdotes. First, in our program in Peru, we had 525 clients of the order of Piscifactoría Los Andes. When we took the top 15 when that project ended, and we looked at what they were producing, 8 out of those top 15 were producing goods and services that if we had had to pre-pick the winners, we would never, ever, ever have chosen. Okay? The moral of the story, stick with the individual transaction. It's not the product that makes the business. It's the goodness of the business proposition itself. And if that's in some kind of good and service that we hadn't thought of before, so be it. Why rule it out of court beforehand? And one comical story that I can't resist telling. It's a friend of mine. He's now retired in Guatemala. He worked in Central America, actually especially in Honduras, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, on a program to promote non-traditional agricultural exports to the United States, essentially entering through Miami and New Orleans. And my friend worked particularly in melons, and Honduran melons still are very successful entering the United States. Anyway, he left, went to about 3 or 4 other countries before he retired, finally come back retired. Anyway, about 5 years ago, he's in the Tegucigalpa airport. Tegucigalpa is the capital of Honduras. And he sees his ex-star melon client. So they go through the whole abrazos thing, the Latin greeting and the whole thing. And by the way, this friend of mine, Ricardo, makes me look tiny. I mean, this guy is enormous. Okay? And he says to this guy, well, how's the melon business going? And the guy responds and said, oh, melons, I got out of melons about 5-6 years ago. He says, why? That was just a fantastic move. Why in the world did you ever get out of melons? No. The market changed. Other people came in. I just really wasn't competitive. So what are you doing now? Oh, I'm selling furniture to North Point in North Carolina? Not North Point, High Point in North Carolina. Right? And Ricardo looks at him and he says, but you don't know expletive about furniture. Right? And what was the response of the client, ex-client back to him? Back 15 years ago, I did no expletive about melons either. The point is, it's not the product, okay? It's the ingenuity of working through. And if you don't organize by product, for the reason of time, I'm going to just run through these. I would argue resources can't do everything. So instead of operating, therefore, with scarce resources by product, dedicate them to regions, particularly regions where you have poverty. And these are some ways that we've cut the pie. In Paraguay, this was our offices in Peru where we actually operated. Note, in the interior of the country, not on the coast where it's a lot easier to work. This was Azerbaijan, Armenia, Bolivia, and we actually developed it for Liberia as well. Okay. The final point here that I'd like to emphasize is, and I alluded to this earlier, but I really want to bat it home. It sounds simple, right? Let the problem determine the solution, rather than coming with a preset solution. Okay? We tend to think exactly the other way. We tend to make statements like, "Oh, finance is the major problem in this area. If we just put in some financial reforms, everything would be fine. Small people really can't get credit, so let's have a microfinance program." Basically, predetermining what the solution is without really knowing what the problem is. FYI, 9 out of 10 of our clients, of those 525 clients, when we first met with them, said that their major problem was a lack of money. When we dug deeper and actually did a diagnosis of their problems, 1 out of 10 was a question of money. Money wasn't the issue whatsoever. Banks in developing countries are awash in cash. I have yet to be in a country in which banks don't have loads of money. The reason they're not lending is because the people who are coming to them don't have markets, don't have good technology, don't have good business practices. So instead of thinking that it's a question of money, let's work on what the actual root causes are rather than on the symptoms to those causes. Okay? And that goes pretty much for any discipline that we may want to talk about. You know, as an economist, I plead guilty as well. Early in my career, the solution to the world, get prices right, everything's fine, right? No way, Jose. Okay, keep our minds open, even though we're grounded in one discipline. Okay, be open to the fact that maybe our discipline is not the one that's actually going to make the difference in that particular case in hand. And let me close and just leave this up. I assume that lots of you have been reading Bill Easterly. Yes? No? Bill is ex-World Bank. He's now at NYU. A bit of an iconoclast at the bank. And he has 2 really major books out. One arguing that we don't align incentives correctly. Remember the example I talked before about us being paid for the time we put in rather than for the results we actually achieve? I mean, the incentives are wrong there. Okay? That's sort of in a nutshell, the bottom line of his first book. In the second book, he talks about the distinction between planning and searching. And rather than trying to plan the whole world as if international development and the alleviation of poverty is like a vaccination campaign, or we're storming Normandy Beach, or whatever metaphor that you want to use, okay? Recognize that the key is to be open and to be searching for solutions to real honest-to-goodness problems and to take responsibility and accountability for those problems, okay? Rather than coming in with master plans. Okay, and this may sound like a fairly innocuous paragraph to look at, but I leave it up there right now so that hopefully you think about it. Because again, it really changes about how we think about doing business. Okay, hopefully I've left enough time open for some questions and
we'll thank you, and let's take some questions. And please wait for the microphone to come to you. If you have a question, raise your hand, please. Brandon, right here in the back. Wait for the mic.
Hello, sir. My name is Brandon. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. Thank you for being here. Earlier, you mentioned giving jobs help to bring people out of poverty. And my question is, how do you help those people that you're supplying for a market, but that market's been saturated? Like, how do you help them transition to another job or help them after that process?
That's part of the searching. That's really, in one sense, I don't have a glib answer to that. That's really part of the point that I'm trying to make, is that we tend to want to walk in with something pre-programmed. But if that market has collapsed, then heck, we've got to look elsewhere. If there is no market anymore for oval watermelons, then heck, let's find some way to produce those square watermelons.
But do you provide training opportunities? I mean, for example, work skill training for someone that
But all of our work skill, one of the things one of the lessons, and maybe in an academic environment, this is not a good thing to say, but one size fits all kind of training that we gave, the value of that was virtually zero. Where training really made a difference is, again, where you've identified the market, you've really identified the problem in real concrete terms, and then you structure the training, you tailor the training to the solution of that particular problem.
Okay, we had a question over here by somebody. Yes, sir, right here.
For the last 50 years, the United States has imposed a trade and travel embargo with the government of Cuba. How would you evaluate the success of that policy and the benefits to the American people to continue it?
I'll punt on that one. I mean, I personally don't believe in the embargo, but I mean, I've never actually evaluated that. You know, what the costs and benefits are. I honestly haven't.
Okay, Matea, here's a question right here.
Hi, Matea Fleischner, the Clinton School student here. And I have a question concerning the method of trust, because I know it's especially in Latin America, it's extremely important, and you spoke a lot about it in Peru. And I was interested in how you approached that as a team. Was it working with local government officials, with people already in the community, or can you elaborate on that?
You know, as much as I was a little bit flippant with the ping pong advisor, it's the personal touch, I think, that really makes the difference. Okay, in the rush to leave some time for questions, when I talked about organizing by geography instead of by product, if you have limited resources for a program, one of the beauties of working by geography is that you're working in specific areas with the people that presumably you're trying to help. If you work by product, typically everybody stays in the capital city and you parachute in and out of the capital city. That's no way to build trust. Build trust requires time, requires sitting at a table. The other example I like to use is drink the drink of choice with the people. Whether it's beer in Peru, Rocky in Albania, tea in Afghanistan, whatever it may be, sit down and spend time with people. Because otherwise that trust really will not be built. And we want to bypass that little thing. We don't want to spend the time. After all, we're agronomists, or we're lawyers, or we're economists, or whatever we are. We want to practice our discipline. But very often it's spending that time that actually I would argue. And I don't have. One thing I would like to note though is, you mentioned perhaps involving local governments and so forth. To actually help some of these business transactions happen, KISS, keep it sweet and simple. And we're very tempted to get everybody involved, but I would argue that too many cooks spoil the broth. We had a couple of cases in Peru in which we involved third-party NGOs, and we involved a local government in a rice operation. And we, meaning our project, nurtured our client, signed a contract with that client, a memorandum of understanding, that we were going to do something, they were going to do something, and that these third parties were going to do, these two third parties, the government and the third-party NGO, okay? Guess which of all those four parties did not keep their part of the deal? And the government. And so we concluded from that, let's not complicate things, okay? That may sound good from a political economy perspective, but from actually getting a business transaction actually executed, keep it simple, okay, rather than complicating things.
Right, further questions? Yes, sir, we got a question right here.
What caused you to choose the places that you worked in, Peru, Azerbaijan, places around the world, and not places of poverty in the United States?
It's where we won contracts. FYI, I'm currently exploring very, very preliminarily to apply this model in Southern Virginia. I'm officially retired at this point, but I'm still antsy and want to. No, but you're absolutely right. And you know, the general question of would this work in the United States? I don't think the model particularly, one particular part of it that I didn't make explicit, but it comes out of the trout example, is the backward linkages. Basically, yes, PC Factoria made money, but 1,700 people got jobs because they were producing for PC Factoria. Now, in the international context, we'd call that outsourcing, but this was domestic outsourcing, okay? That outsourcing, I think, works better in agriculture, you know, within an economy as opposed to internationally. And so I would argue that this particular model, if applied to the US, would probably work better in rural areas, let's say, than in the Bowery in New York. Okay.
Got time for one more question right here. Henry?
Thank you very much. My confidence in the way the government spends my taxpayer money is improved if your thinking is pervasive within agencies like USAID. But purely from a street level question, I deal with a merchant who a lot of people in this room probably do too. Here, and I've done it in California, and I'm frequently asked for donations to microcredit programs. Do you have any comments about is there any clearinghouse or any source that one can verify the effectiveness of these kinds of programs? In fact, we have in the city of Little Rock a major institution which participates in much bigger macro programs.
Yeah.
But the microcredit thing I've always been fascinated by. But is there a way that you know or can feel confident that it is doing what you're trying to do?
The sites that I've seen that compare, say, the work of different NGOs, you know, they use measures such as how much goes to overhead and how much is actually spent on beneficiaries. So that presumably if you keep your overhead low, you're being more effective. Actually, there's an interesting dialogue. There's a whole blog going on at the Stanford Business School at the moment that I've been sort of monitoring. I haven't really jumped in. That argues that that really isn't the case, that's a meaningless measure. It's really what you want to measure by is what comes out the other end. Honestly, when I've seen the work of NGOs compared across, it's more, again, on what they do rather than on what they accomplish. I will note this, though, about microfinance is now an established industry. The evaluations that I have seen of microfinance, and there's been about 3 major ones, almost like meta-evaluations across many different countries over time, are pretty consistent in that microfinance is not a way out of poverty. That they play a very, very important role in providing insurance for families and tiding them over tough times. And that's really, I don't want to deny at all the value of that. That's really. But to look to microfinance as the driver of development, okay, I just don't think the evidence is there. Now, I'm not arguing against microfinance, don't misunderstand me. But I think it's been sold as a poverty reduction, that if you give money, it comes out the other end. Certainly the academic evaluations that I've seen over the years do not support that conclusion. Now, does that mean that certain people have had, like, of course, when we get all of the flyers in the mail that tell us to contribute, what do we see? We see the success stories. But we, you know, how does that, what percentage is that success? And to me, so I really don't want to be put in a position of, to be honest, if you even look at our program, only 50% of the clients that we made original contact with actually turned into something good. But that's the nature of businesses. Some businesses fail, some businesses don't. Okay.
Let's thank Jim for being here with us. It's a great program. Thanks again to the Arkansas School for Math, Science, and the Arts. Thank you all for coming from Hot Springs. And if you all have any questions, as he's over here signing some books, please come by and ask him questions. Have a safe trip home, and thank you for being here.